Pine needles and crushed mint couldn't mask the sweet, rotting copper smell of her own biology. Maeve pressed her forehead against the freezing stone wall, praying the draft would carry the scent away. Down the hall, heavy boots paused. He wasn't supposed to be back from the western ridge. Lye soap burned the raw cracks between Maeve's fingers as she scrubbed the flagstones. The bristles of the brush were worn to useless nubs, much like her patience. She shifted her weight, a sharp ache shooting up her thighs from the hard, unforgiving floor. It was a mundane pain, familiar and dull, a welcome distraction from the heavy, molten pressure coiling deep in her pelvis. She was 2 days into her heat, and it felt less like a romantic awakening and more like a prolonged bout of the sweating sickness. Her skin was clammy, her joints ached, and her temper was fraying like old rope. In the ballads, a she-wolf in heat was a creature of divine magnetism, a goddess of the moon drawing her fated mate through snow and slaughter. In reality, Maeve just felt nauseous. She plunged the brush back into the bucket of gray, lukewarm water. Beneath the harsh chemical bite of the lye, her own scent lurked a thick, dark honey aroma laced with the metallic tang of blood and desperation. To combat it, she had chewed a handful of bitterwort root at dawn. The herb tasted of dirt and ash, leaving a chalky residue on her tongue and a persistent cramp in her upper stomach, but it effectively muted her pheromones. She also carried a pouch of dried mint and crushed pine needles in her bodice, the rough linen scratching against her overly sensitive skin. With every breath, the heavy oak doors at the end of the great hall shuddered open, admitting a blast of frigid autumn air and a chaotic tangle of sounds. Metal clinking against metal, the wet thud of mud-caked boots, and the low, exhausted murmurs of men who had spent the last 3 nights sleeping on the frozen earth. Rhys had returned. Maeve didn't look up. She kept her head down, but she didn't need to see the Alpha King to know he was there. His presence was a physical weight in the room, a sudden drop in barometric pressure. He smelled of rain-soaked wool, horse sweat, and the sharp, coppery stench of fresh blood. There was a jaggedness to his scent today, a feral edge that meant the skirmish on the western ridge hadn't gone smoothly. Maeve squeezed the scrub brush, her knuckles turning white. The bitterwort in her stomach rolled. Her biology, stupid, blind, and demanding, urged her to stand, to bare her throat, to offer comfort to the dominant male. It was a humiliating reflex. She gritted her teeth, focusing intensely on a stubborn grease stain on the stone. "Get the healers to the courtyard," Rhys's voice cut through the cavernous room. It was hoarse, stripped of its usual measured diplomacy. Gareth took a spear to the thigh. Footsteps hurried past her. A servant's skirt brushed Maeve's shoulder, smelling of flour and panic. Rhys's boots, heavy and uneven in their cadence, moved toward the high table. He stopped not 10 feet from where Maeve knelt. She stopped scrubbing. The silence stretched, tight and thin. She could hear the wet rasp of his breathing. A droplet of water or blood hit the stone floor with a soft plaque. Did he smell her? The panic was instantaneous, a cold spike driving through her chest. If he realized an unmated female was in heat within the keep, the protocols would be swift. She would be locked in the lunar cells, essentially auctioned off to the highest-ranking bachelor of his guard, once the fever broke. She was a scullery worker, a packless stray taken in out of pity. She had no rights to choose, no dowry to protect her. Rhys inhaled, a slow, deep draw of air that sounded loud in the emptying hall. Maeve squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the command, the heavy hand on her shoulder. "Bring ale to my chambers," Rhys muttered to an unseen steward, his voice thick with exhaustion. "And hot water." His boots resumed their heavy trek, moving away, up the stone stairs. Maeve let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders slumping. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped the brush into the bucket. The water splashed over her knees, soaking her skirt. It was freezing, but her skin was burning up. The bitterwort was wearing off faster than she had calculated. She needed more. She needed to hide. The kitchens were a suffocating hell of roaring hearths and shouting cooks. By nightfall, the temperature in the keep's lower levels had risen to an unbearable degree, mirroring the escalating fever in Maeve's blood. She stood near the spit, sweat beading on her forehead, plastering loose strands of hair to her cheeks. The scent of roasting venison, heavy with garlic and rosemary, made her stomach churn violently. She had eaten nothing but more bitterwort and a heel of stale bread since yesterday. Her vision blurred at the edges, a soft, pulsating gray that pulsed in time with her erratic heartbeat. "Maeve, take this up to the king's solar," barked the head cook, shoving a heavy iron tray into her hands. "He's refusing the feast, sulking over the casualties, no doubt." "I can't," Maeve croaked, her voice cracking. "Let Clara do it." Clara's elbow deep in plucked geese. "Move it, girl, before the gravy congeals." Maeve looked down at the tray. Roast meat, roasted root vegetables, a thick slab of dark bread, and a goblet of spiced wine. It weighed a ton. Her wrists felt like fragile glass. But arguing would draw attention. She ducked her head, hoisted the tray, and slipped out of the stifling kitchen into the drafty, torch-lit corridors. Every step up the spiral staircase to the royal wing was a battle. Her legs felt filled with lead, her joints grinding with a dry, feverish heat. The mint in her bodice was crushed to a paste against her sweating skin, its sharp scent failing against the rising, overwhelming tide of her own nature. She was terrified she was leaving a trail of scent behind her, as visible as muddy footprints. When she reached the heavy oak door of the king's solar, she paused to catch her breath. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood, closing her eyes. "Just drop the tray on the table, keep your eyes down, and leave." She knocked once, softly, and pushed the door open. The solar was dark, lit only by the dying embers in the massive hearth. The air was thick with the smell of old parchment, leather, and reese. It wasn't the muddy, bloody scent from the morning. This was the true scent of him. Cedarwood, ozone before a storm, and something deeply, inherently warm. Maeve's breath hitched. Her knees buckled a fraction of an inch before she caught herself. The tray rattled in her hands. Reese was standing by the narrow, arched window, staring out at the pitch-black courtyard. He had stripped off his armor and wore only a loose linen shirt and dark trousers. His broad shoulders were tense, the muscles in his back tight under the fabric. "Put it on the table," he said, without turning around. Maeve moved quickly, her boots practically silent on the thick woven rug. She reached the heavy oak table and set the tray down. The iron clanged louder than she intended. She winced, turning to flee. "Wait." The command was soft, but it carried the absolute weight of an alpha. Maeve froze. Her hand was on the brass handle of the door. She didn't turn around. She couldn't let him see her flushed face, the dilated pupils of her eyes. "Sire," she whispered, staring hard at the wood grain of the door. Reese turned. She heard the soft whisper of his stockinged feet on the rug. He didn't approach her immediately. He walked to the table, and she heard the clink of the goblet being lifted. Then he stopped. The silence in the room changed. It went from merely quiet to suffocatingly thick. The hairs on the back of Maeve's neck stood up. She could feel him pulling the air into his lungs, dissecting the scents in the room. The roasted meat, the spiced wine, the wood smoke, and underneath it all, the failing mask of crushed mint and bitterwort. "Turn around," he commanded, quote. It wasn't soft anymore. It was tight. Dangerous. Maeve's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I must return to the kitchen, sire. They are short-handed." "Turn around, Maeve." She swallowed hard, fighting the nausea and the crippling urge to obey. Slowly, dragging her feet, she turned. He was standing by the table, the goblet forgotten in his hand. His eyes, usually a cool, stormy gray, were entirely black. The pupils had dilated, swallowing the iris. He was staring at her, his nostrils flaring slightly. He took a step toward her. Maeve took a step back, her shoulders hitting the solid wood of the door. "You smell of ash and mint," Reese murmured, his voice dropping an octave, rumbling deep in his chest. "You've smelled of it for 2 days." "It's a tonic," she lied, her voice shaking. For a cough. A cough. He took another step. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. The cedar and ozone scent of him hit her like a physical blow, making her head spin. Her biology screamed at her to close the distance, to bury her face in his neck. She clenched her fists at her sides, her fingernails biting into her palms until she felt the sharp sting of breaking skin. The pain helped anchor her. Yes. She stared at the center of his chest, refusing to meet his eyes. Reese reached out. Maeve flinched, bracing for a strike or a harsh grip. Instead, his fingertips lightly brushed the collar of her coarse linen dress. He dragged his knuckles up the side of her neck. A violent shudder ripped through Maeve. A soft, pathetic sound escaped her throat before she could bite it back. Reese's hand froze. He leaned in, his face inches from her neck. He didn't touch her again, but he inhaled deeply, his nose hovering just above her pulse point. Maeve squeezed her eyes shut. It's over, she thought, a cynical, exhausted voice in her head accepting defeat. He knows. You're burning up, Reese whispered, his breath hot against her sensitized skin. He pulled back, finally meeting her eyes. The raw hunger in his black gaze was terrifying, but there was something else there, too. Confusion, frustration. You've been chewing bitterwort, he stated, his jaw clenching. Poisoning yourself to hide. It's not poison, she snapped, a sudden flare of defensive anger breaking through her fear. It's survival. Reese slammed his hand against the door, right next to her head. Maeve jumped, but she didn't cower. She glared up at him, her chest heaving, the fever fully taking control of her senses. Survival from what? He demanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl. From your own pack? From me? From being a broodmare to whatever guard you deem worthy? She spat out, the bitter truth tumbling past her lips before she could stop it. Her knees were shaking violently. The effort of standing, of fighting him and fighting herself, was draining the last of her reserves. Reese stared at her, the anger in his face shifting, fracturing. He looked at the dark circles under her eyes, the feverish flush on her cheeks, the sheer, exhausted terror she was trying to mask with defiance. He didn't yell, he didn't summon the guards. Instead, he lowered his head, his forehead coming to rest against hers. The contact was shocking, electric. Maeve gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to push him away. But they felt weak, useless against his solid chest. Stop fighting it, Reese whispered, his voice stripped of the alpha's authority, leaving behind only the rough, raw edge of a man who was just as exhausted as she was. Stop hiding. He shifted his weight, pressing closer, backing her completely against the door. His lips brushed the shell of her ear. Give it to me. Panic, cold and sharp, finally shattered the heavy fog of her fever. Maeve shoved hard against his chest. Her palm slid against the damp linen of his shirt, lacking the leverage or strength to move a man twice her size. Reese barely shifted, but the sudden, violent rejection registered. He pulled his head back, his black eyes blinking, as he struggled against the haze of his own biology. Don't, she choked out. The word tasted of bile and copper. Her stomach gave a violent, sickening lurch. The massive dose of bitterwort she'd consumed on an empty stomach was rebelling. She didn't have time to be embarrassed. Maeve slapped a hand over her mouth, twisting violently out of his loose hold. She dropped to her hands and knees on the thick rug, retching dryly. Her throat burned. The physical humiliation was absolute. Instead of a majestic she-wolf succumbing to her mate, she was a sick, starving servant heaving on the king's floor. Reese swore. The harsh, guttural sound cut through the ringing in her ears. He was beside her in an instant. He didn't call for guards. He didn't sound disgusted. His large, calloused hand gathered her sweat-soaked hair at the nape of her neck, pulling it away from her face, while his other hand flattened against her, heaving back. Breathe, he ordered. The alpha cadence was gone. It was just a man, panicked by the sudden fragility of the woman in front of him. She gagged again, bringing up nothing but a thin, acidic string of yellow bile. Her muscles spasmed so hard she nearly collapsed face first into the rug, but Rhys's grip on her back held her steady. He smelled of rain and warm cedar, a scent that made her chest ache with a hollow, desperate wanting, even as she trembled with nausea. "How much root did you eat?" His voice was a harsh rasp near her ear. Maeve squeezed her eyes shut. Tears of physical exertion leaked hot tracks down her cheeks. "Enough." "You're an idiot!" He let go of her hair, sliding his arms under her knees and behind her back. Before she could protest, he lifted her off the floor. The shift in elevation made the room spin violently. She instinctively clutched at his shoulders, her fingers digging into the hard muscle beneath his shirt. He carried her away from the door, his strides long and uneven. He didn't head for the hallway to banish her. He kicked open the door to his inner bedchamber. It was freezing inside. No fire burned in the grate. Rhys dropped her onto the massive, unmade bed. The mattress was jarringly soft. Maeve curled into a tight ball, shivering violently as the cold air hit her sweat-drenched skin. "Stay." He disappeared into the dark. She heard the splash of water, the clatter of a heavy basin. When he returned, he carried a damp, freezing cloth. He sat on the edge of the mattress, the bed dipping under his weight. He pried her hands away from her face, his grip unyielding but careful not to bruise. He wiped the cold cloth over her forehead, down her flushed cheeks, and along the line of her jaw. The shock of the cold against her burning skin made her gasp. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, dragging the cloth down her neck to rest against her erratic pulse. Maeve let out a harsh, broken laugh that turned into a cough. "Tell you? Excuse me, sire, but I am in heat. Please do not hand me over to the barracks." "Yes, I'm sure that would have gone well." Rhys's jaw ticked. The muscle jumped beneath his skin. He tossed the cloth into a basin on the floor. "You think I would give you away? I am a scullery maid." She looked up at him, her vision swimming. "I have no bloodline, no dowry. You are a king who needs alliances, not a feral servant making a mess on your rug." "I don't need alliances." He leaned over her, planting his hands on either side of her shoulders, caging her in. The black was receding from his eyes, leaving a dark, stormy gray that was infinitely more terrifying because it was entirely lucid. He knew exactly what he was doing. "I need you to stop shaking." He didn't wait for her permission. He stripped off his shirt and threw it aside. The cold air raised goosebumps on his chest, but when he pulled her against him, his skin was radiating a furnace-like heat. Maeve stiffened, a cynical voice in her head screaming that this was a trap, a temporary indulgence before he threw her out. But the fever was too strong. The scent of him, raw and unfiltered, flooded her senses, drowning out the bitterwort, the nausea, the fear. Her rigid muscles collapsed. She buried her face in the crook of his neck, inhaling deeply. He smelled like safety. It was a dangerous, pathetic lie, but she greedily drank it in anyway. Rhys wrapped his arms around her, pulling her completely into his lap. He buried his face in her damp hair, letting out a long, ragged exhale that sounded like defeat. "You smell like dirt and sick," he muttered against her scalp. "Put me down, then," she whispered back, her fingers weakly curling into his back. "No." He tightened his grip, the hard line of his jaw pressing against her temple. "Mine to hold, mine to clean." For hours, they stayed like that. The fever spiked, dragging Maeve into a delirious, aching void where all she knew was the crushing pressure in her bones and the unyielding anchor of Rhys's body. He forced her to drink tepid water. He wiped her skin when she sweat through her coarse linen dress. He didn't touch her with the frantic hunger of a wolf in the thrall of a mate. He touched her with the grim, exhausting dedication of a soldier keeping a comrade alive through the night. It was the most intimate thing she had ever experienced, and it terrified her more than his lust ever could. Light bled through the heavy velvet curtains, turning the room a bruised, dusty purple. Maeve opened her eyes. The ceiling was carved oak, intricately detailed with wolves and stags. Her throat felt like it was coated in sand, and her limbs were heavy, leaden weights, pinning her to the mattress. But the fire in her blood was gone. The frantic, clawing need that had driven her for 3 days had receded, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. She was no longer in her coarse linen dress. She was wearing one of Reese's oversized linen shirts, the soft fabric swallowing her small frame. She shifted, her joints popping in the quiet room. "You're awake." Reese was sitting in a high-backed leather chair by the dead hearth. He looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with deep purple shadows. Dark stubble coated his jaw. He was wearing the same dark trousers as the night before, his chest bare in the freezing room. He held a cup of something steaming in his hand, but he wasn't drinking it. He was just watching her. Maeve pulled the heavy fur blanket up to her chin, instantly defensive. The vulnerability of the night before crashed over her, making her skin crawl. She had been weak. She had vomited on his floor. She had clung to him like a desperate child. "I should get back to the kitchens," she said, her voice a raspy croak. "They will notice I am missing." They noticed last night. Reese stood up, his joints making the same tired sounds hers had. He walked over to the bed and set the mug on the bedside table. It smelled of willow bark and honey. "I told the head cook you were reassigned to my quarters." Maeve stared at him. The cynical, hardened core she had built over years of surviving as a packless stray immediately sought the trap. Reassigned as what? "Drink the tea, Maeve." "Don't command me," she snapped, her temper flaring. It was a stupid thing to say to an alpha, but she was too tired to filter her words. "I am not one of your soldiers. And I am not a broodmare you can keep locked in your chambers until you tire of the novelty." Reese didn't flinch. He sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped, sliding her slightly toward him. He reached out and grabbed her chin. His grip was firm, calloused fingers pressing into her jawline, forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me carefully, because I am only going to say this once," he said, his voice dropping into that low, vibrating register that rattled her teeth. "You are not going back to the kitchens. You are not scrubbing another floor in this keep, and if any man in my guard so much as looks at you, I will rip his throat out." Maeve's breath hitched. She stared into his gray eyes, searching for the lie, the manipulation. "Why?" "Because you are a stubborn, cynical terror who would rather poison herself than ask for help," he said flatly, his thumb brushing a stray curl away from her cheek. "And because when I walked into the hall yesterday and smelled blood and ash, I nearly gutted my own steward just to find you." He let go of her chin and picked up the mug, shoving it into her hands. "Drink." Maeve took it. Her hands were shaking slightly. The tea was warm and sweet, soothing the raw burn in her throat. She took a slow sip, keeping her eyes on him over the rim of the clay cup. "This doesn't make me your mate," she said quietly, setting the cup down. She needed to draw the line. She needed to protect whatever small piece of herself she still owned. "You didn't claim me." "The fever is broken." Reese leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. He looked at her, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then, a slow, dark smile curved the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator who had finally cornered his prey and realized she was exactly as vicious as he hoped. "The fever is broken," he agreed, his voice a soft, dangerous rasp, "which means, when I finally put my teeth in your neck, you won't be able to blame it on biology." He reached out, his knuckles grazing the collar of his shirt where it hung loosely off her shoulder. "You'll know it was a choice. Your choice." Maeve shivered, but it wasn't from the cold. The heavy, molten pressure returned, pooling low in her stomach, entirely unprompted by a heat cycle. She looked at the harsh, exhausted lines of his face, the dark promise in his eyes. She was a cynical girl, a survivor who trusted nothing and no one. But as his hand slid to the nape of her neck, his thumb resting heavily against her pulse, Maeve leaned into his touch. "Then what are you waiting for?" she whispered. Wow. Talk about a tense resolution. Maeve finally stopped running, and Reese proved he's not just an alpha, but a man who knows exactly what he wants. If you loved the raw emotion and grounded drama in this story, please hit that like button and share this video with your fellow fantasy romance fans. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next gripping wolf shifter tale. See you in the next one!